It's been a huge honour to have been asked to write a new piece to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the Channel Islands, to be presented to the royal family on behalf of the States of Jersey. And it's been a very interesting challenge delivering the piece during the coronavirus pandemic. I wanted to give a short introduction to explain some of the working process, involving the privilege of speaking to some occupation survivors before coronavirus hit the island.
A farmer neighbour who had already got one Russian escapee in his house. Terribly dangerous. He had another one in an outhouse, and he was feeding a third who was in a broken down ruin of a shed.
Researching the artwork, printing and bookbinding. Finding a way to record and mix our fantastic children's choir, the musical originals, and the accompanying musicians remotely, so that it sounded almost like they were in the same room. And creating the engraving and artwork for the final publication. Growing up in Jersey, it was impossible not to notice the many remnants of the darkest period in the island's history that still cover much of the beautiful coastline today. We would play around and explore the abandoned concrete German bunkers and fortifications, and my childhood dreams were often filled with nightmares of Nazis occupying the island. I now feel extremely lucky to have had the chance to study in Germany, and to count a number of Germans among my very closest friends. But 75 years ago, saying such a thing, especially here in Jersey, would have been altogether a different matter. Between 1940 and 1945, the Channel Islands became the only British territory under occupation by German forces, a prize jewel in Hitler's expanding European empire. The islands were as heavily fortified as almost anywhere in the world at the time, and there was roughly one soldier for every 3 citizens. Around 10,000 managed to evacuate from Jersey before the invasion, but most islanders went on to live through 5 long years of very different conditions. Thousands of local houses were requisitioned by the Germans during the occupation. Among those accused of collaboration or fraternization with the enemy were some of the local women who genuinely fell in love with German soldiers. Some others appeared to take advantage of their situation, gaining favours and scarce rations. Either way, they were known by the pejorative name of jerry bags, and were not popular after the war, some having their heads forcibly shaved or being covered with tar and feathers. On the nearby island of Alderney, there was the only concentration camp ever operated on British soil, where it is estimated that thousands were brutally murdered or died of exhaustion. In Jersey, slave workers from across Europe and Russia in particular were brought and kept in harsh conditions, and a number of islanders were deported to camps in Germany, some of them never to return. From the middle of 1943, the penalty for not handing in an illegal radio was death. Canon Kohu was a notable islander who didn't return from incarceration in Germany after being caught with a secret radio. But out of the population at large, very few wireless sets were handed in. With the Allies winning back territories in France following D-Day in 1944, the Channel Islands seemed to be of little strategic importance, their fate remaining in the hands of the occupying forces with supply lines rapidly closing off. In the harsh winter that year, citizens were pushed to the brink, with stories of cats and dogs being eaten, and a lack of medical supplies like insulin having a fatal impact on the vulnerable. But the arrival of the Red Cross ship, the Vega, signalled a change in fortunes, and would have saved a number of lives. In 1945, with the war coming to a close, islanders grew anxious as some of the German High Command vowed not to relinquish power without a fight. But thankfully, terms were finally signed, and a peaceful end to the war came to pass. On the afternoon of the 8th of May 1945, emotional islanders gathered in the Royal Square to hear Churchill's broadcast that our dear Channel Islands are to be freed. And the next day, Liberation Day finally arrived, on the 9th of May 1945, a day after victory in Europe had been declared. Singing the national anthem and cheering at news that the British Navy were approaching the island, locals met with friends, hosted parties, church bells rang, proud owners of radio sets turned up the volume, impromptu dances started, cars and bikes honked and hooted. Smiling British soldiers arrived in St Helier, handing sweets to children and shaking hands with ecstatic locals. This was to be the greatest day in the lives of many people from the island. Today there are signs all across the island of just what this year's Liberation Day means. So the task of honouring what is set to be one of the biggest events in the living memory of a number of survivors of the occupation required finding a particularly suitable text to set to music. Following the advice of local historians and researchers, I quickly discovered that there are countless tales to be told and many more excellent books about the occupation than I could possibly have time to read. A personal favourite was A Doctor's Occupation, detailing Dr. John Lewis's experiences during Nazi occupation. Having to say goodbye to his heavily pregnant wife as she was evacuated to the mainland, Dr. Lewis couldn't have known he wouldn't see her or his unborn son for 5 years. He and his friends learned to survive and stay informed using a number of ingenious methods of getting around deadly serious German troops and regulations, and commit countless small but inspiring acts of resistance. The diary of Baron von Aufsess, the chief German administrator in Jersey, is also fascinating. Already writing on the 9th of September 1944, I know now that we cannot win the war, but I still hope and believe we may win the peace. Von Aufsess comes across as sympathetic and thoughtful, deeply critical of the Nazi regime, but it is hard to tell how much trust to put in his diary began only towards the end of the war, when it could quite literally have been intended as a get-out-of-jail card. But after all my research, I was still having no luck with finding the right words. Thanks to the Channel Islands Occupation Society, I had the amazing opportunity to speak with some occupation survivors, meeting Bob Le Sueur, Trevor Green and Stan Kyler, though I wish I could have spoken with many more. Bob Le Sueur is the kind of man who instills faith in humanity. During the war, he risked everything to help rescue and hide escaped Russian slave labourers through a secret network.
These other people arrived unannounced, and they looked terrible. The German word was Untermensch, subhuman. They were Untermensch. They could be treated like filth. And some escaped. I got to know one. There was a widow, a Mrs. Gould, whose name became famous. And when I went to the house, I was introduced to a young man, and she told me he was Russian. She said, I had to do something for another mother's son. And she became, I'm afraid, indiscreet. She couldn't believe that anyone would ever denounce her. But there were some who did. And she was arrested, and that was the end of it. I knew that he couldn't stay in the sisters' house. They had a Russian too. So he was in my filing room. And it got around somehow in the camps that if you managed to get to that shop and spoke to the woman there, they would find somewhere for you. And that was how I had a number passed to me.
Trevor Green was a boy during the occupation, but retains vivid memories, as well as a fascinating collection of artefacts.
We were very conscious of the fact that they were there, they were the masters, and we had to comply. As a good example of that, this is a copy of the Evening Post, dated the 2nd of July 1940. There it is there. And that piece of paper governed the lives of the islanders for 5 hard years. These were the rules and regulations that we had to abide by. My mother had to apply to the authorities for a new pair of shoes, and we ended up clogs made of wood, leather. The underside there is rubber from a car tire. And of course, the great thing is this is a piece of cardboard, but it represents the saving of our lives, the Red Cross parcel. I will show you one thing more. This is a German flag which was recovered from the town hall just after the occupation, and the flag had been flown in the town hall of Seelleur during the occupation. And I can assure you it is real, real, real.
For some islanders, the feeling of liberation unfolded over a period of time, but for Bob and Trevor, there was a particular moment which stood out.
3 or 4 days after the liberation, I was standing on the corner of what is now called Liberation Square, and 2 Spitfires came over the fort. Zoom! And I glanced up and saw the markings. Oh, there's no need to worry, they're ours. And they flew off and circled and came back and over the fort. Vroom! And something seemed to snap physically inside me. And I burst into tears. But I mean burst. And I was terribly ashamed, because I was brought up, big boys don't cry. And then I could see a man only a few yards away, older than I was, about 40, and he too was in tears.
I was on the beach at the time with other people, and I can see it even in my mind's eye, the 2 Spitfires coming over Fort Regent, over the swimming pool, and we're starting to wave, and the planes gave us, a salute. That to me was the end of the occupation.
Having learnt so much and heard so many stories, I still didn't have a text. But it was only when the 3rd occupation survivor I met kindly lent me a precious book of his that I finally found the words I'd been looking for. Stan Kyler passed away in March before I had the chance to tell him just how kind and helpful he'd been, which is why his name appears at the end of the final production. The book he sent was called Jersey in Jail, with words by Horace Wyatt and illustrations by Edmund Blompier, and I was able to get hold of an original copy. It describes the story of the occupation through poignant poems and pictures, and there was one poem in particular which immediately jumped off the page. Called Faithful and Free, it was originally set to music by P.G. Larbalestier for an operetta called The Paladins, produced in Jersey in 1943. The song is a clear reference to the love of homeland and kinship between Jersey and Britain, but as it was set in the court of Charlemagne, the German censors didn't seem to notice its hidden patriotism and approved it for performance to packed houses. Wyatt kept the 3rd verse hidden until after the occupation, as its meaning was all too clear. I wanted to track down the descendants of Larbalestier and Wyatt to let them know. Sadly, I discovered that Larbalestier had just one daughter who lived in the north of Scotland, had no children, and recently passed away. Tracing the family of Horace Wyatt, the Jersey Archive found through various wills and other documents that he and his wife moved to London soon after the war, had a daughter who kept the same maiden name as that of Wyatt's wife, and they think that the celebrated pop artist Robert Wyatt may likely have been the son of Horace Wyatt's daughter. I've written to him through a contact, and I'm rather excited to hear back from him about what he thinks of the piece. The original plan for the piece was for it to be performed in front of members of the royal family and a huge crowd in Liberation Square, with a handwritten manuscript book being presented to the royals. I wanted the musical score to be written on top of images of Jersey, so I had some fun before lockdown researching the bookbinding needed, deciding that a French fold would allow for less bleed between pages. This meant the paper could only be a certain thickness, and that certain pens and inks, such as acrylic ink, would allow me to do the calligraphy directly on top of paintings and printed images. But in the end, coronavirus soon put a stop to us being able to complete any printing or binding, and I started work on a digital copy of the piece that we could put into a video. I decided to ask some fantastic local photographers for help, Gina Socrates and Shannon the Seelleur, and some of their pictures already looked like paintings. I snuck in a couple of my own pictures, mainly because I wanted to thank my mum and dad by putting them into the project. I then transformed the photographs into paintings using a number of techniques, as this would allow the black notes of the score to show more clearly. When I showed the piece to the project director, the feedback was that the experience of hearing the music was changed by reading the words of the score all the way through, so I incorporated some footage of Jersey which I'd captured over the past few years during long walks around the island. The biggest task remaining was to record the choir and musicians in a way that sounded convincingly like they might have been performing in the same space. I've done this a number of times remotely with professional musicians, but never with a children's choir, let alone with so many recording through their phones in their kitchens. So I prepared a set of video instructions, a digital recording with a range of tempos embedded, and a metronome or click track for each of the musicians to hear the others and stay in time. The choir's conductor, Imogen Nicholls, also helpfully made a video of herself conducting to the backing, and checked all the recordings before they were sent back to me. With such a number of recordings, I needed a little bit of help, and I'd also like to thank Christina Orchard, who did a great job checking and adjusting them before I could finally finish the intricate edits. The lady who would have been our lead violinist, Fiona, is a doctor in Jersey, so obviously she was unable to play for us during this difficult time. Thankfully, my friends in the UK, John Garner and Marie Schreer, stepped in at the last minute to complement our wonderful Jersey musicians, Anna Cavey, Gerard Feuvre, and Katie Feuvre, who sent her recordings over from lockdown in Denmark. All the tracks were finally sent to Sam Briand, who mixes the audio for some of the biggest live shows in Europe, so I knew he can make this sound epic. So a project which began last September, and has involved the work of so many people who I simply can't thank enough for their help, is finally coming to a close, albeit in a very different form to what I had originally planned. I hope it brings some comfort at a difficult time, and I'll leave you with the statement that Trevor wanted to be heard this Liberation Day.
Liberation Day 2020 should be celebrated in as many ways as possible, involving all who live here, regardless of colour, race or creed. We live in a paradise and enjoy two of the most precious things, freedom and peace. Unfortunately, these are not enjoyed by others in many other parts of the world. For those islanders who endured the occupation years, they paid a heavy price for today's freedom and peace.